Hello.
All right, thank you. Hang on, I'm just gonna fix the echo. Uh, There. Can you hear me clearly? Can everyone hear
I
me?
can.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you. I think we're still waiting for some more people, but I think we'll get started now and then they can join. Thank you very much, Lord Finkelstein, for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
My name is Sam Zia, as some of you may know, and I am one of the founders of Oxford Speaks, and I'm really delighted to be joined today by Lord Daniel Finkelstein. Lord Finkelstein's a British journalist, commentator, and politician. He's a regular columnist for the Times of London, and he served as an advisor to former Prime Minister John Major and former Conservative leader William Hague. He also served as the chairman of the think tank Policy Exchange and has been a member of the House of Lords since 2013. A few months ago, I read Lord Finkelstein's family memoir, Hitler, Stalin, Mom and Dad, and I just recommend. I'm sure people in the audience have read it, but if you haven't, I cannot recommend it enough. An incredibly harrowing story, but an incredible story and a really moving one. And it's great to be able to discuss today with Lord Finkelstein about the book. So I think. If it's all right, as we discussed, if we can sort of begin with some general questions about the book and a general overview of it, and then we can move to some audience questions and some more specific questions, if that's okay. But thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Right. So your book starts at the very beginning with your grandfather, Alfred Wiener, setting off to the Reich Chancellery in 1920, in the wake of a sort of a failed putsch to restore or rather take over the government of Germany. Can you tell us a bit about him? Because it seems to me he's so central to the book and the way you put the pieces together.
Absolutely. So this is my mother's father. Alfred was in the First World War, and he came home from that war. I think he was surrounded by Jews who believed that the future promised social equality to go along with the civic equality that had begun to be proffered at the end of the 19th century. And he was clear in his own mind that this expectation was going to be disappointed. He could see the rise of well-funded, very well organized anti-Semitic movements, and he used an interesting phrase, pogroms, to describe what he anticipated would happen. The reason that's interesting is because at the time that he wrote, pogroms had really been the policy of Russia. Um, and I suppose the idea was that Germany had kind of fought the war against that. Certainly, it was one of the reasons why German Jews were enthusiastically on Germany's side in that conflict. And yet, at the end of the war, he's warning that this may soon engulf Germany. And so the early part of my book is about his attempt to combat that, first of all by being part of the organizing movement of the Jewish community, eventually by becoming one of the leaders of German Jews in Berlin in the 1920s. And he becomes convinced that the key force in far right politics is Adolf Hitler. And he becomes convinced of this much earlier than other people. He looks at election data, for example, and that's one of the conclusions he reaches from that. So he begins to collect everything that Hitler or any of his acolytes or associates publish, say, do, claim, and he collects photographs, he collects newspaper cuttings, he collects schema of organizations, he collects things like what uniforms they all wear and what the differences between them are, so that he has a real understanding of who they are, but also so that he can sustain lawsuits, which he then takes out against people like Julius Streicher, who gets sent to jail, actually, one of the people who founded Die Stürmer and later is hanged after Nuremberg. But Alfred sends him to jail in the late 1920s. But when the Nazis rise to power anyway, he's called in to see Goering, who is in charge of this the sort of work with the Jewish community, and he becomes apparent to him that he's going to have to destroy the archive, and that he's going to have to leave the country. And so he does, in fact, end up doing both those things. But he goes to Holland and starts again. He's now in a neutral country and he's got his family around him. He had three daughters. My mother was the youngest, born in 1933. His wife was an economist. She had a PhD, quite unusual at that stage. And she's also an associate with him in his work. Um, he carries on in the 1930s. He spends a lot of his time in Switzerland, where he helps to sue the publishers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in a famous case in Bern, which ultimately ends up with it being proven that the document is plagiarized. This has been a major source of anti-Semitic material. Um, but the interesting thing is, for all that Alfred and Greta, my grandmother, were probably two of the people in the world most aware of who the Nazis were and what they might do, and with least illusions, they still managed to end up being trapped by them. And that is because they thought that Holland would remain neutral. My grandfather went to London to take his collection there, the new collection that he'd begun after leaving Germany, because after Kristallnacht, after the pogrom in November 1938, there was a feeling that his work in Holland might threaten Dutch neutrality. So the Dutch made it clear that he had to stop. He didn't want to do that, so he brought it to London. But he didn't take the children with, or my grandmother, because they all thought Holland was a safer place to be because it was neutral. But ultimately, when the war begins, they end up getting trapped in Holland.
And that's one of the things that was so fascinating reading the book. As you say, these were people, I mean, your grandfather had, been studying the Nazis and was politically, aware and astute. And yet the decision that was made was to keep your family in Holland. Could you explain a little bit more why? I mean, it was the logic was that Holland was a neutral country, whereas the Nazis might actually invade Britain. Was that the
Yes,
idea?
it was mainly about Holland rather than about Britain, to be honest. So the main, because by the time Britain got actually was actually involved in the war, by that point Alfred was then beginning to try to get visas, but it wasn't, long enough ahead of the disaster that engulfed them. But he he was, well, everyone was convinced, and there's a lot of evidence around that time that Holland was like Switzerland, that it would be neutral in the Second World War as it had been in the First World War. So the reason I raise this point is only because I think there's a feeling I encounter a lot in the Jewish community that with enough perspicacity and energy and courage, um, he could have avoided this. And one of the reasons why people feel that is that much of the history of that period is written by the people who did end up, fortunately, in countries where not everyone was killed. So I'll give you an example. My wife's family, my wife's grandfather came here in 1939, and she's often says to me, and it always causes us to have a debate, how great his sort of energy was and courage in coming here and how grateful she was to him for doing that. And he definitely did have energy and courage to do it, but it was also a question of good fortune. Quite a lot of people who lived in Germany, by the way, because the Nazis were right on top of them, they knew they had to get out. People who lived in occupied countries, Poland, Holland, it was much more difficult because they didn't see it coming necessarily. So actually, on both sides, my mother's and my father's side, they both end up in the Holocaust when they did certainly have the intuition that something might happen. But it's not just a question of the means to leave or the instinct to leave or the place to go. It's also picking the right place and being fortunate in that. And on neither side were they fortunate.
And before we turn to your father's story, which is also a period of history, I mean, I studied history, and I can see several people in the audience also. I had very little knowledge of this episode even having taken place, so I'm keen to discuss that. But one of the things you talk about your maternal grandfather, and you talk about his dedication to truth, and he collected all sorts of evidence. There was a trial, I think, in Switzerland in the early on in the book, but where he takes, I think perhaps that was the Elders of Zion trial you just
It was,
mentioned.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I just wondered, when you look, how does that shape your sort of political philosophy now? And
Um,
do you think that
well,
commitment to truth was in a way naive? Do you think it was? Do you think it's justified by
it's a
events?
combination. So it's definitely a motivation for me, and we all fall short of what is our motivation, because one of the problems we've got is um, we're tremendous seekers as human beings after information that justifies our positions, and so when we talk about truth, we often are on the lookout for information that will show us how right we are, and I'm sure I'm as susceptible to that as anyone else. But he certainly believed that if people could appreciate how dangerous and evil the Nazis were, um, that would be a solid political blow against them, and it proved not to be the case. So I think it ended up being both enough and not enough. It wasn't enough to save his family from becoming engulfed in it. It wasn't enough to prevent his country from becoming engulfed by it. It wasn't enough to prevent him becoming an exile and a widower. But after the war, it certainly was critical in a gradual process of which the Nuremberg trials was part, but the Eichmann trial was very important, much of which was sustained by the information that he gathered, um, was critical in establishing what happened. One of the things that the Wiener Library was particularly important. That's the collection of material, because it's still alive, it's still around now. It's in Russell Square in central London, the Wiener Holocaust Library. One of the things it did was to help establish that the Holocaust was something that specifically happened to Jews. If you read quite a lot of the trial transcripts from immediately after the war, it's quite hazy as to what people are quite hazy as to what was actually going on. And the idea that it was an organized attempt to eradicate the whole of the Jewish people, which it certainly was in places like Hungary and Poland, that sometimes escaped people's comprehension for reasonable reasons, and Alfred helped them understand it. So I do think the power of truth was great, but it's not enough by itself.
Well, that's amazing. And I'm actually sitting in Russell Square right now, so I will if it's open to the public, I will try
It
and go
is.
down and pay a visit. Well, let's move to your father's story. And I should have said in the beginning to people in the audience, obviously regulars will know that you can DM the Oxford Speaks Instagram, and your question will come up that way, or you can put it in the chat, or message me on this chat. So at the end we will take those questions as well. But let's move to your father Ludwig's story, because the stories in the book are told, side by side. You go back and forth between them in a really seamless way. And he was born into actually a relatively prosperous family in what was then Poland and Eastern Poland and is now Ukraine, Lviv. And you discuss how his family moves basically into a brand new house in 1938, having been there for decades or centuries, thinking it will be there for decades more, but they only spend a year there. So tell us about what happens to him and his
Yeah.
parents.
So first of all, you said that he was relatively prosperous. I mean, they were rich, the Finkelsteins, and my grandfather Dolu Finkelstein, as he was called Adolf actually, but he was known by all his friends as Dolu. He Dolu was known locally as the Iron King. That gives you some idea of the size and scale and wealth of his business. He was also a senior civic councillor, and my father had really a kind of gilded upbringing. He was the only son of this incredibly well-off man, and he was the only son, in fact, in the family. His brother, Dolly's brother Bernard, had two daughters. So there was a kind of assumption he would ultimately take over the business, and he he uh, he was enjoying this during a period of kind of great prosperity for Lvov because it had rebuilt after the First World War, become part of the Polish nation. It was at a crossroads in terms of trade between East and West. So it was, a very good place to be, but also a very bad place to be because, as well as being crossroads of trade between East and West, it turned out to be also crossroads of war. And it had been in the First World War, and it was about to become engulfed a second time. And of course, now it's involved in its own war with Russia again. So my grandfather had moved into, as you say, into this new house in 1938, a beautiful, progressive, modern architected building. And and at the end of or in the sort of summer of 1939, Hitler and Stalin conclude the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was called a non-aggression pact, but actually contained in a secret annex, which becomes clear decades later, it was actually an aggression pact. It was agreed that they would dismember Poland, and that part of it would go to Russia and part of it would go to Germany. I'm not even sure my father, in his whole life, my father didn't die till 2011, but my father in his whole life understood that it had been parceled up. Because I remember him once saying that becoming part of the Soviet Union rather than Germany was a choice because of all the Jews that were in Lvov. That's not true. There wasn't a choice for anyone there. They had to surrender to the Soviets. And the Soviets took over half of Germany. The other half was taken over by the Germans. And the result of them taking it over was they gradually tried to destroy the bourgeoisie of Poland, the middle class civic leadership. And my grandfather, being, a donor to the synagogue, a member of the city council, and of course a multimillionaire, as well as having been in the army, my grandfather was right in the middle of that. And so he is ultimately arrested and he's sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag as an antisocial element. That was what the description was. Um, the in the mean Before that happened, Lvov had become part of of Soviet Ukraine. One of the things that happened was that the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party came to live in the house opposite my father's house, this house I told you about, the one they bought, which was Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev was responsible for this policy. And when my grandfather was arrested, directly under Khrushchev's leadership, my grandmother was told to come back in 4 days, and she would be reunited with my grandfather. And after 3 days, my father and my grandmother also arrested. What they did was they arrested maybe 10 or 20,000 people in the leadership, and then hundreds of thousands of dependents. Uh, the leadership was sentenced to Gulag. The dependents were deported to the to in our case Kazakhstan, near Siberia, to work in state collective farms. And this was in most cases a death sentence. It was certainly the idea the Soviets had was a little bit of everything. They wanted to suppress uh, any chance that the families would be a troublesome element. Um, they wanted to, so they didn't mind if they died. Um, they wanted to send they wanted to send people to the interior to make money for the Soviet Union, to populate the interior and uh, make it economically more robust, which wasn't very likely to happen. Um, and they also wanted to punish and just dissent. Um, so they were punishing the original uh, people they arrested through their families. Whereas my grandfather was sentenced to 8 years, my father and my grandmother were sentenced to indefinite um, slave labor, I suppose. The only reason why this didn't end with them living there till they died, which wouldn't have been very long because it was below freezing even inside in this wasteland, was that Sir Stalin invaded the Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in order to get the other half of Poland back and break the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And the result of it was that Stalin let everyone go.
Wow. Well, I mean, it is incredible, and reading about it, it almost didn't. I mean, it almost didn't seem real because of how barbaric and arduous these conditions were. What do you think the motivations for on Stalin's part were? Was it just a desire? I mean, it seemed to me that there was obviously desire throughout the history of the Soviet Union to quash kind of nationalist elements within each constituent country. Is that your
Yeah.
understanding of the beyond
Yes,
just?
it was as indeed later happened with the uh, Germans. It was a genocidal attack on Poland, um, and um, the idea was to make the um, but there was another idea. It was economic as well. So the gulags had a double element always. One was, and this was obviously my one was they literally used my grandfather as a kind of pack horse to pull logs to the river. I mean, a pretty stupid use for a 50-year-old billionaire, but or millionaire, right? Who had amazing brain and organizing ability, and but nevertheless, they didn't really care about that, and they also wanted to suppress. They wanted, my father was a kid at the time. He was 10 years old, but he wasn't always going to be 10. So the idea was to make them disappear over there like the field mouse. That's what, like the field mouse, and you'll never see them again. That's what Khrushchev told the people of Lviv about their relatives. So there were a mixture of motives. Both the Soviets and the Nazis did have one similar motivation. They both despised bourgeois liberal capitalism, and they had their own idea about a sort of utopian society which would be produced by liberating their societies from the elite, which was the Jews in the Nazis' case, or it was rich people and the bourgeoisie and the middle class in the Soviet case. I mean, it was a brutal but also pretty stupid idea, but they both shared it.
Yeah. Well, it's fast. It's a fascinating period. Um, and I mean, why do you think that period of history? I mean, we learn about the Holocaust obviously in school and in university. Why do you think that period is so under discussed and I frankly unknown to most people?
So it's interesting. So interestingly, there are a number of reasons. When I talked about it initially, I always said, well, it's simple. The Soviets won and the Nazis didn't.
Yeah.
So there's the element of Nuremberg, for example. Nuremberg tries the Nazis leadership for for a number of things which the Soviets were undoubtedly also guilty of, right? And they were particularly keen to um, to try them for the conspiracy to launch aggressive war, and that's exactly what the Soviets were definitely guilty of that too. So in some ways, it was victor's justice, and but it was remembered, but it produced a memory of the war in which Uncle Joe was on the right side. Okay, then
Yeah.
that's obviously a key reason why it happened. But David Baddiel, the comedian and also intellectual, um, heard my talk, and he said to me, "I think you've missed out something important," and he was completely right. Um, there was something unique about what the Nazis did. So even if you read the history of someone like Albert Speer or who was one of the Nuremberg defendants and Hitler's architect and his one of his few people who could at some point call Hitler a friend, you can see that there's quite a gap between knowing they were killing Jews even through shooting and things and this program of extermination camps. And the extermination camps, particularly the Hungarian and some of the Polish attempts, which were the gathering of people purely for the purposes of simply euthanizing them, right? That was a unique, that's a unique event, and it's uniquely horrible, actually. So that even though it was the case that my father's experience of uh, the conditions my father was in, as you probably know from reading the book. In some ways, they were worse than my mother's condition when she was in Belsen. Um, that what it misses is what happens to Auntie Trudy, my grandmother's sister, to cousin Fritz, who were gassed in Sobibor. That isn't an element. People were shot by the Soviets, but it's not the same thing as this. Mm, but so I think there is definitely a difference which has caused the Nazi crime to become imprinted on the memory, and it's not only the fact that the Soviets were on kind of our side.
Yeah, and moving, I guess, to a more general conversation about the legacy of the Holocaust. How do you approach it? Do you think it's appropriate for people to compare contemporary events or other events to the Holocaust? I mean, I don't know if you've come across the historian Timothy Snyder, but he's sort of a historian of the Holocaust. I don't know what you think of his work, but we haven't discussed this before, so he sort of he pushes back on the idea that we should not that we should never compare anything to the Holocaust. But obviously, you're somebody who studied this in great detail, so you may have a different view. What's your take on that?
But the first thing is, I very strongly think we ought to use the lessons of the Holocaust, and a feeling that it's absurd to suggest that you can never learn and you can't ever mention these lessons because there may be a proportional difference. On the other hand, sometimes people they show a total lack of imagination as to what actually happened under either Stalin or Hitler, and make a comparison which is therefore absurd, and the process of it denies the truth about those events. Um, so I think I think if you do it with care and you are thoughtful about why you do it, there's certainly use to which that can be put.
Excellent. And I had another. Oh, well, this is sort of a more specific question. So those who haven't read the book may not, but I just have to ask you. There was a Jewish council in Amsterdam. And on the theme of sort of impossible choices, I think you were quite critical of the council and what it ended up doing. Do you have sympathy for the position they were in, or do you
Yeah,
think it
completely.
was?
No, so actually, I'm on the standard view of the council. So just to be clear, so everyone knows what it was, the Nazis allowed the Jewish communities, while they still remained in big cities and concentrated areas, they had to be administered. So, for example, there had to be Jewish markets. Um, when they issued yellow stars to people, they asked they got the council to distribute them to Jews, right? And the standard view is highly critical. So, David Cohen, my grandfather's close friend, and the man who had helped him establish the archive in Holland, one of the leaders of the Dutch community, he becomes the chairman of the Jewish Council. And after the war, even though he'd been in Theresienstadt himself, um, he is expelled from the Jewish community. Then, then the Jewish community reverses itself. Um, but Abraham Asher, his co-chairman, never forgives the community, and it was a terrible blow for Cohen as well. And I'm not able to establish my grandfather's um, definitive position, but it seems to me from some of the things that he was pretty sympathetic to Cohen. I am at the sympathetic end. I think they had no so so my grandmother, Greta, ended up working as a secretary for the Jewish Council. She was only in a junior role in that council because she was a woman, um, and therefore she ends up being a secretary to it, despite the fact that she had a PhD and was quite capable of leadership roles. Um, and it was the only way that they could get any money, but also the Jewish community needed fruit. It needed a market. The Jewish community, yes, they sewed the badges on. They gave the badges away, but had they not done that, the Nazis would have kept them all inside until they all had it, right? If it would have taken months, they would have been inside for months. That wasn't really a practical option, so they were given no really good choice. And I am I'm occasionally a bit critical of certain of the decisions. At one point, they provide names to a man called Austerfunten when he asked for them. I think Ferdinand Austerfunten. I think that was a mistake, a moral mistake. Um, but it was very hard. And the traditional view of criticism of them is almost as collaborators, which comes from Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. But Hannah Arendt left the country. Okay, so she was able to get out. She went via Portugal. She ended up in the United States. It's kind of a lot easier from there to make
Yeah.
that judgment. So no, I'm not. I'm at the less critical end. I was thinking of writing a book about this next, but it turned out to be so much Dutch I couldn't really cope with it. So I'm doing something else instead.
Well, I mean, on that, if we move, I know we want to talk about as fascinating as this is, we're going to move to sort of politics and some contemporary issues. How has writing this book and growing up with this family history, how has that shaped your political outlook, do you think,
Okay.
if it has?
So it completely has. So look, part of this is definitely a political outlook that I inherited, but it's reinforced by what I have shaped. I'm a number of things. One is I'm determinedly moderate and very suspicious of extremes. Secondly, I have the standard liberal middle class dislike of like the far right, um, but I have a much less than standard dislike of the far left as well. Um, but I have that position is very strong in me. I'm very institutionally conservative. Um, I uh, I think we live in a wonderful country that's not necessarily standard. I think people who think we don't live in a wonderful country haven't read this history and they don't understand what good and bad is. So all those things have been important. A number of other things. It has also led me to have a sense of proportion. It's really hard to be invested in the argument you're having with Yvette Cooper if you were also writing a book about the impact of Stalin and Hitler on your family's lives. You understand the difference between marginal and incremental debate. So I've never got to hating my kind of democratic opponents, and I can also see um, much more good in them and in their case than I think sometimes happens in political arguments. So it's left quite a big impact on me. Yeah.
Um, well, I'm going to start. We've just had one question come through, so I'm going to turn to that. I have several questions about the recent political, uh, turmoil, shall we say, in the Labour Party. But one student writes, about 5 months ago, from your filming of an appeal to Nick Fuentes that was played to him during his interview with Piers Morgan. I haven't watched this, by the way, but I trust this is, I was wondering if you have had any further reflections on that experience and whether you think you might have still filmed the video today. Do you think that it's
Yeah.
possible to effectively confront or debate someone like that? Well, that's a great question,
Okay.
actually.
So it first of all, I can't complete a discussion in which I said I can see, more than one side of arguments by saying I can't see the side of the argument against doing it. But I still am in favor of it. So let me explain what it was. Nick Fuentes, who is an outright, uh, Nazi apologist, Holocaust denier, I guess. Certainly, the reason why I say I guess is that he kind of half denies it and half says if it happened, it was kind of a good thing or I don't care about it. And he's strongly anti-Semitic. He'd appeared on the Tucker Carlson show, and Tucker Carlson had asked him no questions. Piers then said he was going to have Nick Fuentes on, and he would ask him questions. He had no questions about Nazis or Hitler or Stalin. And so I recorded this video having had a discussion with Piers about the fact that my family would make quite a good case for the opposition. And the result of it was thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, probably just thousands of anti-Semitic messages taunting me about the Holocaust, about the death of my grandmother, um, pictures of me on a bar of soap, pictures of my mum and dad on lampshades, really quite repulsive. And no doubt about it, quite um, emotionally impactful, even though I'm quite resilient. So there has to be a question, would I have done it from the if I'd known it in advance, would I have shown the personal courage to do it? I don't know. I certainly underestimated the response that would occur. But I'm not against doing it. And this is the argument, right? So the argument against doing it is you can't argue with these people. He's going to taunt you anyway. There's no point. All you do is give him publicity. He wants this publicity. Uh, but the counter case was he was already on Tucker Carlson. He's not real. I'm not in a position to deny him a platform. I'm not in a position to um, deny him the ability to taunt people. So it's important to show him that you've got a counter case, that you're not intimidated by him, and most important of all, to those people who were trying to do what Tucker Carlson did. It's very instructive. Tucker Carlson didn't do this, which is ask Nick Fuentes what his view of Hitler was and say it was fine. He just didn't ask him. Right? Because he's aware that actually that view of Nick Fuentes is an Achilles heel, which Nick Fuentes doesn't perceive, but it is. Um, and I think my point was to mean that that couldn't be ignored. So I'm glad I did it, but I can't say it was costless.
Can I ask you, do you think, I haven't really thought through this question, but just listening to your answer just then, where do you think the line should be between, these repulsive views that people like Nick Fuentes have? I mean, what's your view on the legality of that? Do you think it should be legal to say these things? Do you think that,
Yeah, I'm not, yeah,
tell-
I do actually. Yeah, I'm um pretty uh I'm pretty much convinced that people should be allowed to say whatever they want. I think it's a mistake not to, it's a mistake to do this. I seem to have lost my picture of you. Oh, there I am. Oh, there you are. It's a mistake not to allow you can't suppress these views entirely. So I do have a I do so here's my views are a bit more subtle than that. I don't think the law should intervene, right? But it's not compulsory for um YouTube or Twitter. It's not compulsory for them to have these on their platforms. So it wasn't compulsory of Tucker Carlson to invite them. Um, so I thoroughly don't think they should have done. I don't think that Tucker Carlson should have had him on and failed to ask him that question. Once he did, we ended up having to counter it. But it's but I at the moment I think Elon Musk is monetizing grotesque racism, right? And I think personally think that's disgusting. But beyond that, I wouldn't go. I wouldn't prevent him from doing it, um, and I don't. I'm not sure you can even. I'm not sure you physically can.
yeah. Okay. Well, I sort of am going to turn to something slightly different, which is your recent article in the Times about. I think you still do support the Conservative Party, even
Mm.
if you are. I think it's safe to say on the more moderate center-right side of that political
Yeah,
party.
yeah,
Um, and you say the Conservatives shouldn't be forced to choose between different sorts of populism in the upcoming by-election in the
yeah.
Makerfield constituency. You say the party needs its own candidate, even if only a handful of voters want to vote for them.
Mm.
And I would ask you, and you're probably going to disagree with the kind of premise of the question, but where in rhetoric and in this and in rhetoric, I can see how the Conservatives still differ from Reform, but on policy, would you not accept that the current leadership of the Conservative Party and the direction of the party has been pretty conciliatory to
Yeah, look,
Reform?
so I think there's no, I think so. I think that the Conservative Party has a critique of our current political settlement, which actually is fairly mainstream. Tony Blair really just
I was
made the
going to,
same critique.
yeah.
Um, so, and when he was challenged on whether that was the same as Kemi Badenoch, he said it broadly was. Um, my concern with a It's certainly the case that sometimes the Conservative leadership strays into saying things which I think are very similar to right-wing populism. So, for example, I've just seen that Chris Philp, whom I quite like as a person, but he's tweeted criticizing a court verdict on the grounds that Lucy Connolly got 2 years just for a tweet, right? Well, she didn't get it 3 years just for a tweet. Anyway, we can go into that, but I think that is I I kind of so I do occasionally worry about it. I'm not saying I don't, but I think the Conservative Party. I was very interested in what Kemi Badenoch had to say, for example, about Viktor Orban. Um, that she didn't regard herself as a populist like that, right? She's a mainstream centre-right, economically conservative person. I don't think that, the I think there's quite a big difference between, for example, deciding that you're going to abolish all indefinite leave to remain, even for people who've already got that right, and saying um, you're concerned about people receiving mass migration and people receiving it in future. I think it's I think that voters can instinctively tell the difference between Reform and the Conservative Party that they're and indeed do. The Conservative voting profile is quite different from that of Reform. And I mean at the moment Reform is the better part of that, but still it is. So um no, I I I think that also um there is a case. I think Tony Blair makes this case as well in his article. He says that Donald Trump is someone who wants to go. He gets to the wall and he wants to go through the wall, right? Whereas others stop at it. I think that there is a trade-off between um, process and progress, and we've ended up spending too much time on process and not making enough progress. And I think there probably does need to be a rebalancing of the system and of institutions in order to allow us to do more. Um, and but I don't think that's the same as populism. But I do think it makes the Conservative Party it means that a slightly sort of bolder and somewhat more robust rhetoric about what you're going to do is probably justified.
Um, were you surprised by the tenor of Tony Blair's recent? I mean, as somebody, I was surprised. It seemed to me not just as to be a kind of a center-right manifesto, but actually quite a right-wing manifesto. Were you surprised by that?
No, but that's only
Really?
because I've studied him a lot. Um, so he is. There have been moments, and one of these actually was, I think the closest parallel was Palmerston. When Palmerston was leader of the country, the Conservatives understandably found it very, very difficult to find a footing on which to attack Palmerston because his position. And under Blair, the Conservative Party really struggled because where was the ideological space? He occupied all the ideological space that was permissible from the centre right to the centre left, right? And it was very difficult to find a place to land. It didn't mean to say he didn't make any mistakes, but during that period, it was very difficult. Um, and I actually had a conversation with Tony Blair myself, in which I said to him, "We both there's our politics is very, very similar. We differ mainly on whose problem that is, right? For some of my political life, my problem was he was running the Labour Party, and I kind of agreed broadly. There are certain things he did that I think were a mistake, but I kind of agreed broadly. I think that that government ended up spending too much money, and I also think the changes it made to the legal system have ended up being constitutional mistake. Um, but the and I also thought the government wasn't doing enough about migration at a fairly early stage. Um, but at the same time as thinking that, um, I I could, he was politically triumphant and he was the leader of the party, uh, and it was difficult for me. But I said to him, by this point, I think the problem is mainly yours. So he's now in a position whereby he supports the Labour Party while offering Kemi Badenoch's critique of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's good to know that you weren't surprised. That's very interesting. Another student has written in, um, do you think events in Gaza over the past 3 years constitute genocide, and or are you offended by people comparing them to the Holocaust?
Hmm. Okay, well, let me just give you a bit of history first, right? As you know from my book, my grandfather was not a Zionist. Um, in the post-war era, uh, he changed his mind only because there were hundreds of thousands of displaced Jews. He had spent all of his youth saying, um, "I'd rather stay in Germany. Um, there's not enough space." People, he was an Arabist and a study of Islam, a student of Islam. He did his PhD on Islam, and he thought there'll never be a secure state of Israel there anyway. And he was worried that the Jewish people who were setting up the state would be high-handed and arrogant towards the people who lived there, but also the people who lived there wouldn't accept them. And on the other hand, people were saying, well, if we stay here, we'll all die, right? And they were both correct. That is the great tragedy of the Jewish community. But I've always believed, as Alfred came to believe after the 1945, in a pragmatic, practical way, that the state of Israel has to exist. And the war in Gaza um, is a response to the repeated failure of the people who live there to accept that the state of Israel has to exist. The origin of that I completely understand, right? So one of the things that I always teach is it's very easy for us to give each other like read our speeches to each other, right? I don't think we should do that. We should try and learn from each other. And the aspiration for Palestinian nationhood is correct. The feeling in 1948 that they wanted to resist the creation of Israel is completely understandable. Um, the uh, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is a moral and strategic error. And the Israeli government contains within it those people who I think would like to turn a war of defense into a genocidal war. Um, I personally think the use of the term is designed to suggest that Israel's main objective in Gaza is to wipe out the Palestinian people. And actually, I don't believe that to be the case. But I'm nervous about getting into it because I think even to start that debate would disguises the fact that in this war, I think war crimes have taken place, and one of them, war crimes took place against Israel, but also by Israel, and one of those war crimes has been taking actions that sometimes careless about the relationship between the outcome and the number of innocent people who would die in achieving that outcome. Um, it's very, very hard to know whether that's the case because I'm like, look, I live in Pinner. I'm Jewish, but I'm not a military historian. I'm not a journalist on the ground or even near the ground. I'm not an expert. So I actually can't answer that question based on what I know. Um, but the thing that has upset and worries me about the term genocide is that while I've made all the concessions that I've made here, I do notice that term was introduced deliberately into the discourse by the Soviets in the 1970s, that it has been used consistently and was used by Israel against Israel before it could conceivably have achieved that title, right? And at that point, I felt it was simply an attempt to troll Jews. The great tragedy of it is, I think that we've got to a situation where there's a debate between two sets of people. One is pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza campaigners who pay no heed whatsoever to whether Israel continues to exist, despite the fact there are millions of Jews living there, and to the history of the Jewish people, right? That is in itself a genocidal claim, okay? And then you get the other people who are not interested in in creating a two-state solution with the Palestinians, are not interested in Palestinian human rights, and are pretty cavalier about the impact that it has on the lives of ordinary Palestinians. And I haven't got time for either of those groups, right? I don't belong to them. I'm not part Israeli. I'm Jewish, and with a history that makes me understand and makes me very defensive about the existence of of Israel because it's clearly required, and history suggests that. Um, but I I don't claim a sort of I feel that we're those of us who've got any sense about how this might end are trapped between two sets of extremist people who want us to pick sides. And I find, I don't want to pick the side of people campaigning through the street with posters about Israel's genocide when their whole claim is genocidal on Israel, right? Which is let's drive the Jews out of Israel. I know they said that they claim that they're going to have a single state with, secular binational state, and you think, oh, do me a favor. You're not that. No one really thinks that's credible. Let's get serious about what we should create there. So that's my answer to that question. I don't know whether it's quite the one you're hoping for.
Well, that's very interesting. I almost think there's another question on a completely different topic. I almost think we need another Oxford Speaks, interview, perhaps in person, to discuss this issue,
Sure.
in greater detail. But finally, a student asks, what kind of advice or tips do you have for someone who wants to get into writing and commentating on British politics? And how do you go about your own writing, and where do you turn for sort of news and views yourself?
Okay. So the most important thing about journalism and about all writing is it's about knowing things. It's about finding things out and conveying them. Okay. So most people think journalism starts with writing, with technique. Um, Journalists vary in their technique and their writing skills. What they don't vary in is they always know stuff. The basis of my journalistic career is knowing a lot about politics and history. Um, and I try to be the person in the room who knows the most, either about contemporary politics or about political history. So if you're going to go into a field of journalism, the first thing that I would suggest is really, really know, because that's all you're conveying to people, information. Sure, one part of knowing is demonstrating techniques for finding things out. And so therefore being a if you're somebody who's got a generalist knowledge, but you're very good at getting people to tell you things, that's a way of knowing. But it's all about knowing things. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, knowing things means reading very widely and all that, and as well as very deeply. Try and find an area that you're interested in, reading that very deeply, but also make connections, consume a lot of media. Consume the media you hope to be part of, because then you'll understand it um, better. And then take a view of where you think the future of media is. It's clearly going to be heavily video based. Um, Having the ability to convey your views through pictures, all that sort of stuff is very important. And clearly, the ability to manipulate the latest technology, which is now going to be AI, that is very important. Um, and being able to find things out and know things using those techniques is part of my advice. And then finally, of course, the other thing about journalism is it's all about making contacts with people, right? Because one of the things that you need to do is, as a journalist, is find things out from people. So you want to have a wide circle, professional circle, go and introduce yourself to people, um, and follow up with those people to make those contacts and connections. That never fails. So there was a brilliant book by a guy called Richard Wiseman who did a book on luck. And he said, did luck exist? Right. So one of the experiments he did was to give a lottery number to loads and loads and loads of people, and to see whether there was a difference in the results for people who said they were lucky and who people who said they were not lucky. And there was no difference, right? Obviously, it was random. Um, but he then said, when he did a study of how many people got their jobs through chance meetings, he discovered that the reason they got their jobs through chance meetings is because they had more chance meetings than everyone else. right? And the people who got their jobs through parties went to more parties and talked to more people at them and went to the right parties. So those are a few pieces of advice.
Well, thank you. I know we're coming up on an hour. You've
Well,
been
sorry,
very,
there is one thing I would add to it,
yes.
which is to all of you, right? Um, who are embarking on the beginning of your career, which is find the things that you love and never give up on them, right? The only person who can make what your ambition is not happen is you. Um, and I think it's really important in life to try to spend your life earning your money from something you love. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Well, thank you. As I just said, you've been very generous with your time, Lord Finkelstein, and it's been a real pleasure to have you. And I hope, perhaps in person, with some more advanced planning on our part, we can have you in person in Oxford and discuss all these issues and
Sure,
more. But thank you for joining us. Much
no problem.
appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
All the
everyone.
best.
Have a good
Bye bye.
evening. Bye bye.